The ice moon of Vexara 7 had never been kind to the Kalari, and tonight was no exception. Rachel's breath crystallized in the sub-zero atmosphere as she trudged through the violet snow, her thermal suit barely holding against the relentless cold. She had been tracking the distress beacon for 3 hours now, expecting to find crashed cargo or perhaps a downed probe. What she found instead would change everything humanity thought they knew about the Kalari species. The den was carved into the crystalline cliff face, barely visible through the swirling snow. Rachel's scanner picked up multiple life signs, weak, fading, but definitely there. She approached cautiously, her hand instinctively moving to the plasma cutter at her hip. First contact protocols echoed in her mind, but they seemed absurdly inadequate for whatever awaited her in that frozen cave. She peered inside. 6 pairs of luminescent eyes stared back at her from the darkness. Cubs. Kalari cubs, no more than a few months old by her estimation. Their fur, which should have shimmered with bioluminescent patterns, hung dull and lifeless against their tiny frames. They huddled together in the center of the den, their breathing shallow and rapid. The adult Kalari, their parent, Rachel assumed, lay motionless at the back of the cave, partially buried in snow that had blown through a crack in the rock face. "Oh no," Rachel whispered, her translator catching the sound and broadcasting it in standard. The cubs flinched at her voice, pressing closer together. One of them, braver than the rest, lifted its head. Its eyes locked onto Rachel's faceplate with an intelligence that sent a shiver down her spine. And it wasn't from the cold. The cub made a sound, something between a chirp and a whimper. Rachel's translator struggled with it for a moment before spitting out, "Cold. Mother won't wake. Cold." The Kalari weren't supposed to be sapient. That was the official designation. They were classified as semi-sentient megafauna, protected under the Wildlife Preservation Act but not granted the status of intelligent species. Looking at those eyes, hearing that plea translated into words, Rachel knew the classification was catastrophically wrong, but that was a problem for politicians and xenobiologists. Right now, these cubs were dying. Rachel backed out of the den and scanned the immediate area. The cliff face offered some shelter, but not enough. The den itself was compromised, and the temperature was still dropping as Vexara 7's perpetual night deepened. She needed to get them warm and fast. She couldn't bring them to her ship, it was too far and they were too weak to move. That left only one option. Rachel gathered what she could find: dead vegetation frozen into the ice, pieces of crystallized resin from the rare phosphor-wood trees, and some of her own emergency fuel pellets. She arranged them carefully at the mouth of the den, just inside the threshold where the wind wouldn't scatter her efforts. Fire. She was going to make fire. It was such a primitive solution, something her ancestors had done 100,000 years ago on Earth. But humans had never forgotten fire, even as they reached for the stars. It was in their DNA, this knowledge of warmth and light in the darkness. The plasma cutter made short work of ignition. The fuel pellets caught first, then the resin, and finally the ancient vegetation began to smolder and burn. Smoke filled the den entrance before finding its way out through the crack in the rock. The flames cast dancing shadows across the ice walls, and for the first time in hours, Rachel felt genuine warmth on her face. She looked back at the cubs. They had crept forward, drawn by the heat and light. The brave one, Scout, Rachel decided to call him, was closest. His small paws stretched toward the flames with something like wonder in his eyes. "Fire," Rachel said softly, and her translator converted it. "It's called fire. It will keep you warm." Scout tilted his head, processing. Then he turned back to his siblings and made a series of clicks and chirps. The other cubs slowly approached, forming a semicircle around the fire. Their fur began to shimmer faintly as their body temperature rose, the bioluminescence returning in soft waves of blue and green. Rachel monitored the fire carefully, adding fuel when needed. She taught Scout, and through him the others, to stay back from the flames to respect the heat while drawing comfort from it. The cub was a remarkably quick learner, mimicking her gestures and even attempting to arrange smaller pieces of fuel at the fire's edge. As the night wore on, Rachel realized she had a problem. Her thermal suit was running low on power, depleted by the extended exposure to Vexara 7's extreme cold. She could recharge it at her ship, but that would mean leaving the cubs, and the fire would die without her to maintain it. The decision was surprisingly easy. Rachel removed her outer thermal layer and draped it over the cubs, tucking it around their small bodies. They chirped in confusion at first, then settled into the warmth, their eyes beginning to droop with exhaustion. Scout remained awake longest, watching Rachel with those intelligent, knowing eyes. She moved to the entrance of the den, as far from the fire as she could get while still being able to tend it. The cold bit into her immediately, even through her inner suit layer. But the cubs were warm. That was what mattered. Rachel fed the fire through the night, her body growing numb as Vexara 7's temperature plummeted to lethal levels. She thought about her ship, about the warm bunk waiting for her there. She thought about the report she would have to file, about the firestorm that would erupt when humanity learned the truth about the Kalari. She thought about her mother, who had told her stories of their ancestors on Earth, huddling around fires just like this one, keeping the darkness at bay. But mostly she watched the cubs sleep, their gentle breathing proof that she had made the right choice. Dawn on Vexara 7 came not with light. The ice moon was too far from its star for that, but with a subtle shift in temperature, a bare few degrees that meant the difference between survival and death. Rachel's suit alarms had been screaming for hours, warning her of hypothermia and system failure. She ignored them, adding the last of her fuel to the fire. Scout woke first. He crawled out from under the thermal layer and approached Rachel, who was barely conscious now. The cub pressed his small body against her side, and Rachel felt a wave of warmth spread through her. The other cubs joined him, one by one, forming a living blanket around the human who had sacrificed her own safety for theirs. Their fur blazed with bioluminescence, generating heat that their species only produced when in groups when working together. The Kalari had evolved this ability to protect their own during the long night. Now, they used it to protect Rachel. When the rescue team found them 12 hours later, they discovered something unprecedented. A human woman surrounded by Kalari cubs, alive despite exposure that should have killed her 3 times over. At the center of the den, a small fire still burned, tended by a young Kalari cub who had learned from his human teacher. Scout looked up at the rescuers and spoke his first word in Standard. Clear and unmistakable. Mother. He wasn't referring to the cold body at the back of the den. The galaxy would never be the same.